They surrounded his ranch without drawing a single weapon, and somehow, that made it worse. The wind moved slow across the dry Texas plain, dragging dust along the fence line like it had all the time in the world, and Caleb Turner stood there with one hand resting near his belt, not on the gun, just close enough to remember it was there, watching 30 Apache riders form a quiet half-circle around his land, their horses still, their faces unreadable beneath the morning sun that hadn't yet burned the chill out of the air. And at the center of them all, a woman stepped forward, her posture straight, her presence heavier than the rest, like the land itself had chosen her to speak, and when her boots touched the dirt 10 feet from his porch, she didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for anything, just looked at him with eyes that carried years he hadn't lived through and said, "You fed me and broke our sacred law." And the words didn't land like anger, didn't carry threat the way he expected. They settled slow, like something already decided, something that had been walking toward him long before these riders ever appeared on the horizon, and Caleb frowned just slightly, not confused, not yet, but searching, because in his world, feeding someone wasn't a crime. It was survival. It was what a man did when another human being looked like they hadn't eaten in days, and the silence that followed stretched longer than it should have, broken only by the soft shift of leather and the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere far above, and he took one careful step forward. Off the porch, boots pressing into the dry earth, measuring the space between them without closing it, because something about the way she stood told him distance mattered, not out of fear, but out of respect, and he studied her face, the shape of it, the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, the faint line near her jaw that looked more like memory than injury, and something stirred in the back of his mind, not clear, not whole, just a fragment, like a dream half-remembered, and then she moved her hand slowly, deliberately, and let something fall from her fingers into the dust between them, a small, hardened piece of bread, worn by time, edges cracked, surface darkened by years that had no business touching something so simple, and Caleb's breath caught before he could stop it. Just a slight hitch, but enough, because he knew that bread, not the exact shape, not the exact piece, but the weight of it, the choice behind it, the moment it came from, and suddenly the quiet morning shifted, not in sound, not in movement, but in meaning, because somewhere deep in his memory, a cold night began to rise. A fire barely holding on against the wind, and a small figure standing just outside the light, too thin, too still, watching him the way a starving animal watches something it doesn't trust but can't walk away from, and he hadn't thought about that night in years, hadn't needed to, because out here, you did what you had to do and kept moving, but now it stood in front of him again, carried in the eyes of a woman who no longer looked like someone who needed saving, and the riders behind her didn't shift, didn't speak, they just watched, as if the entire moment balanced on something invisible between two people, and Caleb realized, not all at once, but slow and certain, that whatever had happened back then hadn't ended the way he thought it did. It had waited, grown, changed, and now it had come back, not with noise, not with violence, but with something far harder to face, something that didn't ask for his gun or his strength, only his understanding. And the woman spoke again. Quieter this time, like she didn't need to repeat herself for it to matter. "You don't remember," she said, not accusing, just stating what already was, and Caleb looked down at the bread in the dust, then back at her, and for the first time, he felt it, not fear, not exactly, but the weight of a moment he hadn't known was still unfinished. Caleb did not answer right away, and that silence stretched across the dry land like something alive, pressing against his chest, slow and heavy, because the truth was he remembered pieces, not the whole of it, just fragments that refused to stay buried now that they had been called back into the light, and he shifted his weight slightly, boots scraping against the dirt, eyes still locked on the woman as if looking away might make whatever this was real in a way he could not undo, and the riders behind her remained still, not tense, not relaxed, just present, like they were part of something larger than themselves, something that did not need movement to carry weight, and Caleb finally spoke, his voice steady but lower than before. "I gave food to a lot of people passing through," he said, not defensive, not dismissive, just stating what had been true for years on a stretch of land where hunger did not ask for permission before it arrived, and the woman tilted her head just slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of something deeper than the words themselves. "Not like that night," she replied, and the way she said it carried memory, not accusation, and Caleb felt it then, clearer now, the cold that had settled into his bones that evening long ago, the kind of cold that came after sunset when the wind picked up and the fire burned low no matter how much wood you fed it, and he could almost see it again, the faint glow of embers, the long shadows cast by the fence posts, and a small figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, unmoving, watching, and he remembered how he had noticed the way the child did not step closer, did not speak, just stood there as if waiting for something invisible to allow it, and he had nearly turned back inside, nearly let the night take care of its own business, because out here, a man learned to mind his distance, but something in the stillness of that moment had stopped him, something quiet and stubborn that did not belong to reason, and he had reached for the last piece of bread he had left from the day before, hard and dry, but enough to keep a person going, and he had held it out without stepping forward, without saying a word, and the child had hesitated, just like now, that same pause, that same weight in the air, before taking it slowly, hands careful, eyes never leaving his, and he had nodded once, not expecting thanks, not needing it, just a simple exchange between two people who would likely never meet again, and then she had disappeared into the dark, as silent as she had arrived, leaving nothing behind but the faint imprint of small footsteps in the dust that the wind erased before morning came, and Caleb blinked, the memory settling into place with a clarity that made his chest tighten, and he looked back at the woman standing in front of him, no longer searching, because now he saw it, not in her face alone, but in the way she held herself, in the quiet certainty that surrounded her like a second skin, and he exhaled slowly. "You were that child," he said, not as a question, but as something he could no longer deny, and she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and for a moment, nothing else moved, not the riders, not the wind, not even the dust along the fence line, as if the land itself was waiting for what came next, and Caleb felt the weight of it again, heavier now that he understood, because whatever law she spoke of had been set into motion the moment he chose to act, and he had never known, not then, not until now, that a simple piece of bread could carry consequences that would travel years to find him again. The words settled between them like dust that refused to rise again, and Caleb felt something shift inside his chest, not fear, not regret, but recognition of a line he had crossed without knowing it was there, and the woman did not move closer, did not raise her voice. She simply let the silence carry the weight of what had already been said, while somewhere behind her, one of the horses exhaled slowly, the sound soft but deliberate, like even the animals understood this was not a moment to disturb, and Caleb glanced once more at the piece of hardened bread lying in the dirt, then back at her, his brow tightening just slightly as he tried to measure what kind of law could travel years to return to a man who had done nothing more than offer food to a starving child, and she seemed to read that question before he spoke it, because her eyes softened, not with kindness exactly, but with something closer to understanding, as if she had stood where he stood now, and had taken just as long to see it clearly. "In my people's way," she began, her voice steady, each word placed carefully like stones across a river. "Food is not only food," and Caleb listened without interrupting, because something in her tone told him this was not explanation for his sake alone. It was something she had carried for years, waiting for the moment it could be spoken. "When someone takes food from another," she continued, "it binds more than hunger." And she paused, just long enough for the wind to move again across the fence line, brushing past them like a quiet witness. "It binds spirit, it binds path, it says your life and mine are no longer separate." And Caleb felt that land deeper than anything she had said before, because out here, a man believed in simple things, water, land, survival, but this was something else, something that did not follow the rules he had lived by, and yet he could not deny the weight of it, not with the way she stood there, not with the way the riders behind her held their silence, like it meant something, and he let out a slow, breath, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he tried to place himself inside that understanding. "You're saying I owe you," he said, not as a challenge, but as a man trying to name something unfamiliar, and the faintest trace of a smile touched her lips, not amused, not mocking, just acknowledging how close he had come without quite reaching it. "No," she said softly, "I am saying you changed my path." And the difference between those two things hung in the air, subtle but undeniable. And Caleb felt it settle into him in a way that did not demand agreement, only acceptance, and he glanced past her for the first time, noticing how the number of riders seemed larger now than when he first stepped out onto the porch, how the line extended farther along the ridge than he had realized, shapes against the horizon that had arrived without sound, without announcement, and the realization did not bring panic, only a deeper sense that whatever this moment was, it had been building long before he saw it, and he brought his gaze back to her, steady now, grounded in the same quiet resolve he had carried through years of drought and silence. "Then tell me what this law asks," he said, and she held his gaze unflinching, as if measuring not his words but the space behind them, the part of a man that did not speak, and when she answered, her voice dropped just enough to carry something heavier than before. "It does not ask," she said, "it requires," and the wind stilled again. The dust settled, and for the first time since they arrived, Caleb understood that whatever came next would not be something he could walk away from. The word required did not come with anger, it came with certainty, and that made it settle deeper than anything sharp ever could, and Caleb felt his shoulders ease just a fraction, not in relief, but in acceptance of something he had not chosen, yet somehow belonged to him all the same, and he nodded once, slow and deliberate, the kind of nod a man gives when he knows the next step matters more than the last. "Then tell me," he said quietly, his voice steady against the stillness around them. "What does it require of me?" And the woman watched him for a long second, not testing him, not weighing him, but recognizing something in the way he stood there without stepping back, without reaching for anything that might make this easier, and behind her, the line of riders remained as they were, unmoving, patient, as if time itself had agreed to wait for this moment to unfold, and she took one small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make her presence feel less like something approaching and more like something already there. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that same measured calm, but now there was something else beneath it, something older. "The law says that when a life is sustained by another, that life must one day return and stand where it began," she said, and Caleb listened, his brow tightening slightly as he followed each word, not because he did not understand them, but because he was beginning to understand them too well. "It says that what was given without asking must be honored without refusal," she continued, and the wind shifted again, brushing past them like a breath held too long, and Caleb glanced once toward the horizon, noticing now that the riders stretched farther than he had first seen, shapes layered against the pale sky, silent witnesses to something that felt larger than any one man's choice, and he looked back at her, his voice lower now, more grounded. "And what does that mean for me?" he asked, and she did not hesitate, did not soften it, did not turn away from what had to be said. "It means you must accept what you gave," she replied, and the words hung there, simple, but carrying a weight that did not need to be explained twice, and Caleb let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting once more to the piece of bread in the dirt, then back to her. And for a moment, the years between that night and this morning seemed to collapse into something smaller, something closer, and he realized that whatever he had done back then had not ended when the child walked away. It had only begun, and he straightened slightly, not in defiance, not in readiness, but in understanding, because out here, a man did not always get to choose what followed him, but he could choose how he faced it, and the woman watched that shift happen in him, subtle but clear, and she gave a faint nod, almost to herself, as if confirming something she had known before she ever arrived, and then she turned her head just slightly, and for the first time, one of the riders behind her moved, not forward, not in threat, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if the moment had reached a point where it could no longer remain still. And Caleb felt it too, that invisible line being crossed, not by force, not by demand, but by something deeper, something that did not ask permission because it had already been set into motion years ago, and he looked back at her one last time before speaking, his voice calm, steady, and without hesitation. "Then I will stand where it began," he said, and the wind carried the words across the open land, not as a challenge, not as surrender, but as a man choosing to meet something that had come for him without ever raising its voice. The moment he said it, something shifted in the air, not visible, not loud, but real enough that even the horses seemed to settle deeper into the ground beneath them, and the woman held his gaze for a breath longer. Before turning slightly, her movement small but enough to send a quiet signal through the line of riders behind her, and one by one, without a word, they adjusted their positions, not closing in, not stepping away, just aligning as if forming a boundary that had always been there waiting to be seen, and Caleb noticed then that no one had crossed onto his porch, not a single boot had touched the wooden steps, and he understood that whatever this law was, it respected lines even as it drew them tighter, and the woman stepped aside just enough to clear the space between him and the open land beyond his fence, and she gestured with a simple motion of her hand, not commanding, not inviting, just indicating what came next, and Caleb glanced once back at the door behind him, the worn wood, the handle he had turned 1,000 times without thinking, the place that had held his silence for years, and for a brief moment, something like hesitation brushed against him. Not fear of what stood ahead, but recognition of what he was about to leave behind, because stepping forward meant more than moving his feet. It meant carrying that night with him into something he could not yet see, and he stepped down from the porch, boots hitting the ground with a dull, grounded sound, and the dust rose just slightly around his heels before settling again, and he walked toward the open space, not rushed, not slow, just steady, each step measured by the same quiet resolve that had kept him here. When others had left, and when he reached the fence line, he paused, his hand resting lightly on the top rail, feeling the rough wood beneath his palm, and he looked out across the land, the dry stretch of earth, the distant ridge, the same horizon he had watched for years without expecting anything to return from it, and now it stood filled with witnesses, with meaning, with something that had been waiting longer than he realized. And he stepped over the fence, not climbing, not hesitating. Just a simple motion that carried more weight than it should have, and when his boots touched the other side, the woman moved again, this time walking forward until she stood beside him, not in front, not behind, but level, and for the first time, he noticed the detail of what she wore, not just the fabric, but the symbols worked into it, patterns that spoke of something older than memory, something carried through generations without needing to be explained, and she reached down slowly and picked up the piece of hardened bread from the ground, holding it in her palm as if it had never lost its purpose, and she turned it once, letting the light catch its worn surface, before extending it toward him, and Caleb looked at it, not as food, not anymore, but as something that had outgrown its simple beginning, and he hesitated only for a breath before taking it, his fingers closing around it carefully, aware of its fragility, aware of what it now represented, and when he looked up, she was watching him, not for what he would say, but for what he would do next, and the riders behind them remained still, the line unbroken, the silence unchallenged, and Caleb understood then that this was not about repayment, not about balance in the way he had known it. It was about recognition, about stepping into something that had been set in motion long before he knew its name, and he held the bread in his hand, feeling its weight settle into him, and for the first time since they arrived, he did not feel like a man being judged. He felt like a man being asked to remember something he had forgotten he believed in. Caleb held the bread a moment longer than necessary, feeling its dry edges press against his palm, as if it carried a memory that refused to fade, and the woman beside him watched without urgency, without pressure, because whatever came next was not something that could be rushed, and the wind moved again, low and steady across the open land, brushing against his coat, lifting the dust in soft patterns that disappeared as quickly as they formed, and he turned the piece once in his hand. The surface rough, worn by years that had no business touching something so small, and yet here it was, unchanged in purpose even if time had tried to take its shape away, and he looked at her, his voice quieter now, not uncertain, but grounded in a different kind of understanding. What happens if I refuse? He asked, not because he intended to, but because a man needed to hear the edges of the road before he chose which way to walk, and she did not answer right away, not out of hesitation, but because the answer did not belong to words alone. And when she finally spoke, her tone did not carry threat, only truth. Then nothing breaks, she said, except what you already began. And the meaning settled slowly, deeper than anything sharp or immediate, and Caleb understood that this law was not about force, not about consequence in the way he had known it. It was about something that continued whether he stood still or moved forward, and he nodded once, more to himself than to her, because the choice had already been made the moment he stepped off the porch, and the rest was simply walking it through. And she reached into the fold of her garment and drew out something else, something small, wrapped in a strip of worn cloth, and she unfolded it carefully, revealing a thin cord, threaded with a simple piece of carved stone, smooth from handling, its surface marked with patterns that caught the light in quiet ways, and she held it out between them, not offering it yet, just letting him see, and Caleb studied it, his brow tightening slightly as he took in the detail, the weight of something that had been carried for years without losing its meaning. And she spoke again, softer now, as if the land itself was listening closer. When I left that night, I carried what you gave me, she said, and my people saw it, not as food, but as a mark, and she lifted the cord slightly, letting it sway once before stilling again. This was made so I would remember what it meant, and Caleb felt something shift again, not in the air, but in himself, because the simple act he had forgotten had not only stayed with her, it had been shaped, honored, turned into something that outlived the moment itself. And she stepped a fraction closer, closing the space just enough that he could feel the presence of it, not imposed, not forced, just there. And she extended the cord toward him, this time fully, her hand steady, her eyes holding his without demand, and he looked from the stone to her face, searching not for permission, but for understanding, and finding it in the quiet way she stood, and he reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest second as he took the cord, and the contact was light, almost nothing, but it carried a weight that lingered longer than it should have, and he looked down at the stone resting in his palm beside the bread. Two simple things that now held more than he could have imagined, and the riders behind them remained silent. The line unbroken, the moment contained within something larger than any one man or woman could claim, and Caleb closed his fingers around both, feeling their presence settle into him, and he understood then that this was not the end of what had begun years ago. It was only the part where he finally stepped into it with open eyes. Caleb did not open his hand right away, and the weight of the stone and the bread rested there like two quiet truths waiting to be understood together, and he stood still, feeling the dry wind move across his face, the same wind that had passed over this land long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone, and for a moment, everything narrowed to the space between his breath and the steady presence of the woman beside him. And then he closed his fingers slowly, not gripping, just holding, as if acknowledging that both things now belonged to him in a way he could not separate, and she watched that movement, not with approval, not with relief, but with a calm recognition that something had aligned as it should, and behind them, the riders shifted again, not stepping forward, but lowering themselves in unison, a subtle motion that carried no sound but changed the shape of the moment entirely. And Caleb noticed it without turning, sensed it more than saw it. The way a man senses a storm before it breaks, and he looked at her, his voice quieter than before, almost thoughtful. "This is not a debt," he said, more to himself than to her, and she answered without pause. "No," her tone steady. "It is a bond," and the words settled deeper than anything she had said before, because a debt could be paid, closed, forgotten, but a bond remained. It stayed. It shaped what came after, whether a man wanted it to or not, and Caleb exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting across the line of riders now lowered behind her, each one still, each one present, not as threat, not as force, but as something else entirely, something that did not belong to his world, yet stood inside it without asking permission, and he understood then that this was not about what he owed or what he had given. It was about what had been created between two lives in a single moment that neither of them had fully seen at the time, and he turned his attention back to her, steady again, grounded in the same quiet strength that had carried him through years of silence. "Then what happens now?" he asked, and for the first time since she arrived, something in her expression shifted, not softer, not lighter, but more open, as if the answer she carried was no longer something held back. And she stepped forward just enough to stand directly before him, her presence no longer measured by distance but by something closer, something that did not need space to hold its weight, and she spoke slowly, each word placed with care. "Now it is witnessed," she said, and Caleb felt that settle into him in a way that did not need explanation, because the riders behind her were not there to enforce anything. They were there to see it, to carry it, to make it real beyond the two of them, and she continued, her voice low but clear, "And what is witnessed cannot be undone." And the wind moved again, stronger this time, lifting the edge of his coat, brushing against the stone and the bread in his hand, and Caleb looked down briefly, then back at her, and something in him steadied, not because the situation had become clearer, but because he had stopped resisting what it was, and he gave a small nod, not out of agreement, but out of understanding, and the riders behind her remained as they were, lowered, silent, holding the moment in place without a single word, and Caleb realized then that whatever this law required, whatever this bond meant, it was not something that would end here, it was something that would follow, something that had already taken root in a place deeper than choice, and for the first time since they arrived, he did not feel like a man standing alone against something unknown. He felt like a man standing inside something that had been waiting for him to see it clearly. The word witnessed did not fade when she said it. It lingered, as if the air itself had taken hold of it and refused to let it pass, and Caleb stood there with the bread and the stone in his hand, feeling something settle into place that had been shifting for years without him knowing, and the riders behind her did not move, did not rise. They remained lowered in that quiet formation, their presence no longer a question but an answer he had not known he needed, and the woman turned slightly, not away from him, but enough to let her voice carry beyond the space between them, and when she spoke again, it was not louder, just broader, like something meant to reach more than one man. "It is done," she said, and the words moved through the line of riders without echo, without repetition, as if each of them had already heard it before she spoke, and Caleb felt the meaning of it before he understood it, because nothing had been taken from him, nothing had been demanded, and yet something had changed that he could not step back from, and he looked down at what he held, the bread that once filled an empty stomach, the stone that now carried a mark he did not fully understand, and he realized that both had become the same thing, not objects, but proof, and he lifted his head again, meeting her gaze, steady now, not searching anymore, and she stepped closer, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance, and she reached out, not to take anything, but to touch the edge of his hand lightly, her fingers brushing against his knuckles for just a second before pulling away, and the gesture was small, almost nothing, but it carried something deeper than words, something that did not belong to explanation, and she spoke once more, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "From this day forward, your life stands within ours," she said. And Caleb felt that settle into him in a way that did not feel like ownership, did not feel like control. It felt like something else, something steadier, something that did not ask him to change who he was, only to understand that he was no longer separate from what had found him, and she turned then, not abruptly, not with finality, just a simple movement that signaled the end of what needed to be said, and as she did, the riders behind her began to rise, one by one, not in haste, not in unison, but in a quiet rhythm that felt more like breath than motion, and Caleb watched them, not with suspicion, not with relief, but with a growing sense that what had happened here would not be spoken of again, not because it was hidden, but because it did not need to be. And the woman walked back toward her place among them, her posture unchanged, her presence just as steady as when she arrived, and before she reached her horse, she paused, just for a moment, and without turning back, she said one last thing. Her voice carried lightly on the wind. No one will touch this land without standing before us first. And the words did not sound like a promise. They sounded like a fact, something already set into motion the same way the law had been years ago. And Caleb stood there as the riders began to turn, their horses moving in slow, deliberate steps, not retreating, not fleeing, simply continuing on a path that did not need to be explained. And he remained where he was, the fence behind him, the open land ahead, and for the first time in years, the silence around his ranch did not feel empty. It felt guarded, it felt seen, and he closed his hand around the bread and the stone, holding them not as reminders of the past, but as something that had quietly reshaped his future without ever raising its voice. The sound of hooves faded slowly into the distance, not rushed, not scattered, just a steady rhythm dissolving into the open land until even the dust they carried settled back into silence, and Caleb remained where he stood long after the last rider disappeared beyond the ridge, his boots rooted in the same ground that had not changed, though everything else had, and the wind moved again, softer now, brushing across the fence line, slipping through the dry grass, carrying with it the faint echo of something that no longer needed to be seen to be understood. And he opened his hand at last, looking down at what remained, the hardened bread, the carved stone, two simple things that had crossed years to return to him, not as objects, but as something that had quietly rewritten the space he lived in. And he turned them once in his palm, feeling their weight not in ounces, not in measure, but in meaning. And for a moment, he stood there between the land he knew and the horizon that had answered him in a way he had never expected. And then he stepped back over the fence, the same motion as before, but not the same man making it, and he walked toward the porch, each step slower now, not from hesitation, but from the kind of stillness that comes after something settles deep enough that it no longer needs to be chased. And when he reached the door, he paused, his hand resting on the worn wood, feeling the grain beneath his fingers. The years pressed into it, the quiet life he had built inside those walls, and he glanced once over his shoulder, out across the land that stretched wide and empty and no longer felt empty at all, and he noticed something then, something small, something that might have gone unseen on any other day, a marker set just beyond the fence line, not tall, not carved in any way that demanded attention, just a single stone placed upright in the earth, its surface marked with the same pattern as the one in his hand, subtle, deliberate, unmistakable, and he walked back toward it, slow, measured, as if approaching something that did not need to call for him to be found, and he crouched slightly, studying it, the way it caught the light, the way it stood without leaning, as if it had always belonged there, and he did not touch it, did not need to, because he understood what it meant without asking, and he straightened again, looking out across the horizon, and for the first time in years, he did not see distance as something that separated him from the world. He saw it as something that connected him to it, something that had already reached him once, and would again if it needed to, and the wind moved through once more, quieter now, carrying no dust, no tension, just the steady breath of a land that had witnessed something and accepted it without question, and Caleb slipped the stone and the bread into his coat, not to hide them, not to keep them safe, but to carry them the way they had been carried to him, and he turned back to the porch, stepping inside without closing the door right away, leaving it open just enough for the light to reach the floor, and he stood therein, that space between inside and out, between what had been and what would follow, and he did not speak, did not need to, because out here, some things did not ask for words. They asked for a man to stand still long enough to understand them, and when he finally closed the door, the sound was soft, almost lost in the wind, and the land beyond it remained as it was, wide, quiet, and no longer his alone.